The boy whispered in a language the world had forgotten, and within days, all the other children could speak it too, their voices bending the church itself to ruin. Before we continue deeper into this story, make sure you hit like and subscribe. You won't want to miss the rest of what's hidden in the shadows. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive. In the winter of 1964, in the forgotten cold of Pennsylvania, a child arrived at a Catholic orphanage with no name, no records, and no past. He was 8 years old, pale, fragile, seemingly harmless, but within hours of his arrival, every soul inside those walls understood that this was not a child like the others. He spoke. And when he spoke, it was not English. It was not Latin. It was not Hebrew or Greek or any known tongue ever recorded in the annals of history. His words carried a resonance that clawed at the bones of those who heard it, as though the syllables themselves did not belong to the human world. Witnesses swore that when the boy opened his mouth, the temperature in the room dropped. The lights flickered, and even those who did not understand a single sound he uttered felt their stomach twist with primal fear. One nun would later write in a journal entry, an entry quickly confiscated and buried by the diocese, that she could feel her own memories bending when he spoke. She described it as if her thoughts were no longer her own. Within a week, the orphanage was no longer a place of prayer and discipline, but a theater of whispers and shadows. Children woke screaming in the night, repeating the boy's strange syllables. The youngest ones began drawing spirals and sigils they had never been taught. And by the end of that first month, 3 children were gone, vanished, their beds still warm when they were discovered missing. No broken windows, no forced doors, just an emptiness, as if they had been erased. This is the story you were never supposed to know. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was buried. Intentionally, methodically, erased from every archive, sealed in the vaults of the church, locked in classified government files. Because the boy's voice, his impossible language, was more than words. It was power. The kind of power institutions have killed to contain. The kind of power that still waits in the cracks of history, humming beneath the surface, waiting for someone else to speak it aloud. The orphanage itself was not remarkable at first glance. St. Mary's Home for Children stood at the edge of the woods, its bricks blackened by decades of winter storms. It was the kind of building you could pass without ever remembering, the kind of place designed to vanish in plain sight. But those who lived there, in 1964, remember a silence that was never natural. They remember the way the corridors seemed too long, the way the chapel's crucifix always leaned ever so slightly, as if recoiling from something it could not sanctify. And into this fragile silence the boy was delivered. No birth certificate, no baptismal record, no surname. The priest who signed him and claimed he was left in a basket on the church steps one night, as though abandoned by shadows themselves. The nuns named him Arhan. At first, his presence was dismissed as coincidence. Another orphan with a troubled mind. But the church kept meticulous files, and those files reveal an unsettling detail. The boy did not cry when scolded, did not laugh when the other children played. He only watched as if observing a world not his own, and then he began to speak, at meals, at prayer, at night, when the other children were supposed to be asleep. The sounds that came from his mouth were jagged, rhythmic, and heavy, like iron scraping against stone. It was not babble. It was structured, deliberate, carrying patterns and repetitions that suggested grammar. One nun described it as the architecture of a hidden kingdom. Soon, the children repeated after him, unbidden. They whispered his syllables during morning mass. They drew crude shapes on the walls with chalk, spirals intersected by lines that no one had taught them. The language spread like an infection, one voice seeding itself into many. When confronted, the boy simply smiled. Witnesses said it was not the smile of a child, but the smile of someone remembering something ancient. The diocese grew concerned. They summoned Father Daniels, a man known for his zeal and iron faith, to investigate. He attempted to record the boys on a ledger, but the ink smeared. Not once, but every time he tried to write, the letters bled across the page, warping into shapes he could not control. That ledger still exists, hidden in the vaults beneath the church, its pages warped, blackened at the edges, as though the language itself resisted capture. And that was when the first disappearance occurred. It began quietly, almost too quietly, as if the building itself knew what was about to happen and refused to protest. The first disappearance was a boy named Ryan. He was 9 years old, restless, always eager to laugh, the kind of child who softened even the sternest nun's heart. And yet, in the weeks after Aaron arrived, Ryan changed. At first, it was small. He stopped playing with the others, choosing instead to sit near Arhan during meals, staring at him as though waiting for instructions. He mumbled to himself at night, words no one could recognize, syllables that hissed and broke like waves on jagged rock. When the nuns tried to comfort him, he pushed them away with uncharacteristic violence, his small hands trembling as though something unseen controlled them. Then one night, in December's deep cold, Ryan vanished. The children awoke to his bed still warm, his blanket twisted as if he had risen only moments earlier. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no broken windows, no forced locks. The door remained barred from the inside. It was as though he had stepped into the air and dissolved. The nuns searched every room, every corridor, every basement chamber. The police combed the grounds with dogs and lanterns. Nothing. Ryan was gone. The next morning, several of the younger children whispered the same thing to investigators. They said Ryan had followed Arhan into the circle. When pressed, they could not explain what the circle was. They drew spirals on scraps of paper, crude, overlapping lines that matched the strange marks later found etched into the wooden floorboards near the chapel. Father Daniels insisted Ryan had simply run away. He declared the boy's drawings to be childish nonsense, the whispers the product of hysteria. Yet his own behavior betrayed him. In private letters later uncovered, he confessed that he had heard Ryan speaking in Arhan's impossible tongue just hours before the disappearance. Daniels admitted that he himself had felt drawn to the rhythm of those words, his thoughts clouded by an ancient pull. He begged the diocese to remove Arhan from the orphanage, but they refused. Instead, they locked the child in a separate room at night. They thought confinement would contain whatever contagion he carried, but they misunderstood. Containment is impossible when the infection is not in the body, but in the language. That winter, 2 more children would vanish. Each disappearance left behind only silence, and the faint echo of words no one was ever meant to hear. The second disappearance happened less than 3 weeks later, and by then the fear inside St. Mary's had fermented into something heavy and unspoken. The nuns no longer ate in silence. They prayed with trembling hands, their eyes darting toward the boy locked in his narrow room at the end of the hall. They could hear him even through the wooden door. He never screamed. He never begged. He simply spoke. A low, constant stream of syllables that made the air feel thinner, as if the building itself resented every sound. The child who vanished next was a girl named Layla. She was only 7, known for humming hymns when she swept the corridor floors. Witnesses say that in her final days she no longer hummed the old church songs. Instead, she hummed the cadence of Arhan's strange speech. Not the words. She could not shape them. But the rhythm, the pattern, like a lullaby that carried something not meant for children. The night she disappeared, snow was falling in heavy sheets. The sisters made their rounds, the hallways were locked, and yet by dawn her bed was empty. On the wooden floor where she had slept, small chalk marks appeared, spirals, intersecting lines, symbols the other children swore she had drawn in her sleep. When investigators arrived, the chalk crumbled under their touch, staining their fingers black, as if it were ash and not chalk at all. The police demanded answers. They searched the orphanage grounds again, brought in dogs, questioned every child. But the children would not speak to them. They only whispered to each other, repeating Arhan's syllables in low, reverent tones. A policeman, in his official statement, admitted that standing in that dormitory, listening to the children whisper, felt like standing inside a church that did not worship God. His report was censored, archived, and never spoken of again. The diocese, panicked, demanded obedience from the sisters. They were ordered to say nothing to the press, to keep silent about the boy, the language, the disappearances. Father Daniels performed nightly exorcisms in the chapel, but his prayers faltered, his voice broke, and several sisters claimed that his Latin was being overtaken mid-sentence by Arhan's syllables. Even Daniels himself wrote, in a confession found years later, that he sometimes woke from dreams with those words still wet on his lips. The official line was simple: 2 children had run away. Nothing more. But the sisters knew better. The children had not fled into the woods. They had followed the voice. And the voice belonged to a boy who was never meant to exist. By the time the 3rd disappearance struck, whispers had already bled beyond the orphanage walls. The town of Coldwater, Pennsylvania, was small, tight-knit, the kind of place where even a broken fence post drew attention. 3 missing children in one winter was more than coincidence. It was a wound. Parents began pulling their sons and daughters from the school attached to the orphanage. Church attendance dropped, and yet no one dared openly accuse the sisters. Fear works best when it lives in silence. The 3rd child was Daniel, 10 years old, older than the others, bold and sharp-eyed. He had been the one who dared mock Arhan to his face, imitating the strange syllables in cruel parody. The nuns chastised him, but Daniel never apologized. He said the boy wasn't human. Said he didn't eat like the others, didn't laugh, didn't sleep. Said he could hear him whispering at night, even from 3 rooms away. Then Daniel began to change. The sisters noted how his handwriting, once neat, became erratic. He started scrawling the same symbols that had appeared by Layla's empty bed, filling his school books with spirals and jagged lines. He told the younger children to cover their ears at night, because the words wanted to crawl inside. When Sister Margaret found him in the library, staring at an open Bible, she realized with horror that he wasn't reading. He was listening to something that wasn't there. And then one night Daniel vanished. But this time there was no empty bed, no open window, no footprints in a snare. Instead, there was fire. His mattress, his sheets, even the wooden slats of the frame, all burned to black ash. But nothing else in the dormitory was touched. No smoke damage, no flames spreading. Just a perfect circle of ruin where a boy had once lain. The sisters swore the smell was not of burning wood or cloth, but something acrid, metallic, unearthly. The investigators who came refused to write the truth in their reports. They said, possible accident. They ignored the fact that no candle, no lantern, no match had been anywhere near that room. But the children knew. They said Daniel hadn't been taken. He had been claimed. For the first time, even the town began to suspect that what was happening inside St. Mary's was not of this world. Men muttered about curses. Women crossed themselves twice when passing the gates. Yet still no one entered, no one dared. Because the boy with the voice was still inside. After Daniel's disappearance, St. Mary's was no longer an orphanage. It was a pressure chamber, every breath heavy with suspicion, every shadow carrying weight. The sisters stopped speaking freely, even among themselves. Their eyes lingered too long on each other's faces, searching for weakness, for corruption. Some whispered that one of them had made a pact, that one of them was feeding the boy's gift, that no language could grow stronger without a servant. The Mother Superior, Sister Helena, tried to restore order. She commanded stricter prayers, doubled the vigils, forced every child to fast. But her voice cracked when she spoke, and her hands trembled when she clutched the rosary. At night, she locked herself in her room, stuffing cloth beneath the door to block the sound of Arhan's voice. She had begun to believe that if she heard too much of it, the words would stick to her thoughts like burrs to fabric, and she would never be able to scrape them off again. The nuns began turning against each other. Sister Margaret accused Sister Claire of secretly writing down the boy's words. Claire, in turn, accused Margaret of protecting him, claiming she had been caught kneeling outside his door, listening. By spring, 3 sisters had fled entirely, abandoning their vows and slipping into the night. They left no notes, no explanations. Only one of them was ever found again. Days later, wandering the forest barefoot, muttering Arhan's syllables with bloodied lips, as if chewing on glass. The children grew restless, but not fearful. They began to form small groups, whispering to each other, eyes glancing toward Arhan's locked door, with something closer to reverence than dread. They copied the symbols he scratched onto the floor with broken chalk, hiding them under their mattresses, carved into desk wood, etched into the undersides of hymnals. When one nun tore a page from a boy's notebook, she found not a single word of English, but entire passages in Arhan's impossible tongue. He had become their teacher, their prophet, And then came the night when Sister Helena herself broke. The other nuns found her at dawn, standing barefoot in the snow outside the chapel. Her habit torn, her hands blackened with soot. She kept repeating one phrase over and over in Orphan's language, rocking like a child. They tried to pull her back inside, but she bit down on her tongue, splitting it open, blood running down her chin. She wanted silence, but silence no longer wanted her. By then, even the Vatican had heard whispers. Not in official reports, but through frightened letters, smuggled accounts, murmurs among the clergy. St. Mary's was no longer considered a place of God. It was something else entirely. And they knew sooner or later they would have to intervene. By early summer, the orphanage was divided into two kinds of children, those who still prayed, and those who whispered. The prayers grew weaker, hollow, spoken only out of fear of punishment. But the whispers, they carried weight, rhythm, a kind of quiet intoxication. The nuns tried to beat it out of them, washing their mouths with soap, forcing them to kneel for hours in the chapel. But children are resilient in ways adults cannot understand. They learn to whisper only when the sisters slept. One boy, Francis, was caught scratching strange diagrams into the underside of the dining hall tables. Circles within circles, lattices of lines, like spiderwebs collapsing inward. When confronted, he did not cry, he did not beg. He simply said, "Orphan is teaching us how to go home." No punishment silenced him. No prayer bent his will. He continued to draw, to whisper, until the sisters began keeping him bound at night. And yet, even in chains, he smiled. The older children, once skeptical, began to give way. They watched the younger ones murmur in their sleep, and curiosity gnawed at them. A girl of 13, Anna, confessed that she had begun dreaming in a language she could not speak when awake. In her dreams, she said, she could understand every word. She claimed that the language carried shapes, colors, patterns, that each syllable was more than sound. It was a key. The sisters wrote frantic letters to the bishop, begging for intervention. They claimed the orphanage had become an altar, that the children were slipping beyond their reach. But no reply came. The bishop, it seemed, wanted nothing on paper that might stain the church. Meanwhile, Orphan was no longer silent behind his locked door. The sisters often found the children huddled near the threshold, as if listening to a sermon. He spoke not in screams, but in a low, steady current, words flowing like water through rotted wood. The strange part was this: his voice did not weaken him. He never coughed, never strained. The boy spoke as if the words did not come from lungs or throat at all, but from somewhere beneath the floor, using him as a vessel. One night, Sister Claire claimed she saw the door itself breathe. She swore the wood expanded and contracted with each syllable, as though the entire building had grown lungs. The others dismissed it as hysteria, but they could not ignore the truth. The orphanage was no longer theirs. It belonged to the boy and whatever spoke through him. By then the town had stopped sending food. Deliveries went unanswered. Priests refused to visit. The orphanage became an island, sealed by fear, forgotten by the very church that built it. And in that isolation, the voice grew stronger. It was Sister Claire who finally broke the command. For months the boy had been kept locked away, his door barred at night, his meals slid in through a narrow opening. None of them dared cross that line. But silence eats at a soul, and whispers corrode faster than screams. Claire claimed she needed proof that what they were enduring was not madness, not collective hysteria, but something real, tangible, undeniable. She entered the boy's room just before dawn, carrying a lantern. The others watched from the hall, their eyes wide, their lips moving in prayer that sounded more like begging. Inside, the air was heavy, not full but thick, clinging, as if the room itself resisted breathing. The boy sat on the bed, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes wide open though he had not been disturbed. His face was pale, thin, but his gaze was sharp, more aware than any child should ever be. Claire asked him, softly, who he was speaking to at night. Orphan tilted his head, like a bird listening, and then he whispered back in that same impossible tongue. A cascade of sounds that seemed to fold in on themselves, words that carried too many syllables at once. Claire said later that she did not hear them with her ears. She felt them in her bones, in her teeth, in the pounding of her heart. She demanded he speak in English, that he tell her what he wanted. The boy smiled, the first time any of them had ever seen him smile. His lips parted, and for a moment, just a moment, he obeyed. Not me. That was all. 3 words in a clear, childlike voice. And then the flood returned, the language rushing out of him, louder now, faster, until the lantern shook in her hands. The sisters in the hallway swore the sound did not stop at the doorway. It spread through the corridor, vibrating in the stone, rattling through the floorboards. One sister fainted. Another tore at her veil, begging Claire to come out. But she did not. She stood frozen until the boy's words slowed, and his head fell limp as though he'd fallen asleep. When she finally staggered back into the hall, she was no longer the same woman. Her hair had turned several shades lighter, her hands trembling so badly she could not hold the rosary, and when she tried to pray, no Latin came, no English. Only fragments of the boy's language falling from her lips like ash. That was the night the sisters stopped calling him a child. From then on, in their letters, in their whispers, he had another name. The vessel. After Sister Claire's return from the vessel's room, something irreversible shifted among the children. Until then, their whispers had been fragments, imitations, half-formed syllables that dissolved under the weight of fear. But within days of her encounter, their language grew sharper, cleaner. They no longer repeated sounds like a game, they recited them like scripture. At night, they gathered in small groups, no longer afraid of the sisters' patrols. They pressed their foreheads together in a circle, whispering the words in perfect rhythm, their voices blending into a single current. One child would begin, another would follow, until the chain tightened and the syllables built into something that did not sound like children at all. The sisters tried to break the circles apart. They slapped, dragged, beat the little ones who resisted. But the more they punished, the stronger the devotion grew. One girl, barely 6 years old, stood with bloodied knees on the chapel floor after hours of forced penance. When Sister Helena demanded she pray, the child only smiled and whispered, "You can't chain the sea." Words no 6-year-old could invent. Symbols began appearing everywhere. Not crude drawings this time, but precise etchings. On the backs of pews, carved into the underside of stair rails, hidden beneath mattresses. Spirals folding into spirals, impossible lattices of angles that seemed to move if one stared too long. The children claimed Arhan had shown them in dreams, that the symbols were not drawings at all, but doors. The sisters argued day and night about what to do. Some demanded the boy be exorcised again. Others said he should be sent away locked, in some monastery where no ears could hear him. But who would take him? Who would risk the contamination? The Vatican had not answered their pleas. The town had turned its back. They were alone in the ruins of their own faith. And then came the most disturbing moment of all. During evening mass, as the organ wheezed out a hymn, every child in the chapel turned their head at the same instant, not toward the altar, not toward the crucifix, but toward the closed door of the vessel's room. They did not move. They did not blink. They simply stared, silent and intent, as if waiting for a cue that never came. That night, several sisters admitted privately that the children no longer belonged to them. They belonged to him. Not by choice, not by force, but by a gravity that none of them could resist. It was no longer a question of whether the vessel would spread his language further. It was a question of how long the walls of St. Mary's could contain it. The first undeniable rupture came during the Feast of Corpus Christi. For years, it had been the most sacred celebration in St. Mary's, a procession of hymns, incense, and the Eucharist raised high above bowed heads. The sisters hoped, foolishly, that the tradition might anchor the children, remind them of order, of faith, of God's presence. But the children had other plans. As the chalice was lifted, the chapel fell unnaturally still. Not reverent silence, but something else, as though the air itself was listening. Dozens of small eyes shifted away from the altar again, not with distraction, but with a focus so sharp it seemed to cut. Their lips began to move, quietly at first, then louder, until the Latin hymn drowned beneath the sound of the vessel's language. It was not chanting. It was answering. The sound came in waves, overlapping, layered, each child picking up where another left off. The syllables built into something deeper, thicker, echoing off the vaulted ceiling like the stones themselves were repeating them. The organ sputtered and failed. Candles bent sideways as if under a sudden wind. And then, the most terrifying moment of all, The host itself, the consecrated bread, split in the priest's hand without touch, cracking down the center like dry earth. The priest dropped it. The children laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, but in delight, as if they had been waiting for the moment when one symbol would break before the other. The sisters screamed for order. Some rushed the children, dragging them toward the doors, but the children did not resist. They smiled, their mouths moving even as they were struck. The language poured out of them like a second breath, like blood that could not be stopped. Later, Sister Helena swore that in that moment, she saw not children at all. Their faces blurred, their voices stretched, and for a fraction of a second, she glimpsed something vast leaning behind them, like shadows projected on stone. She collapsed at the altar, clutching her rosary so tightly that the beads cut into her palm. That night, they locked the chapel. They barred the doors, extinguished the candles, and declared it forbidden. The house of God had been surrendered. It no longer belonged to their Christ. The children, however, did not mourn. They did not weep for the closed chapel. They gathered in the halls and whispered, smiling with secret knowledge. For them, the feast had been fulfilled, and from that day on, no prayer could drown them out. It was Sister Margaret who fell first. Among them all, she had been the most defiant, the most relentless in her rejection of the vessel. She carried herself like a soldier of God, unbending, iron in her voice, never allowing the whispers to touch her ears. She punished the children most harshly, silenced the others when they spoke of fear, insisted that faith could endure anything if one clung tightly enough. But faith is not armor, and defiance, when stretched too far, can become brittle. It began with tremors in her hands, small at first, barely noticeable as she lit the chapel's candles or turned the pages of her breviary. Then came the sleepless nights. She wandered the halls long after curfew, muttering psalms under her breath. When asked why she did not rest, she snapped that rest was weakness. Yet her eyes grew darker, ringed with purple shadows, and her voice carried an edge that had not been there before. One evening, as she led the children in prayer, the words faltered. She opened her mouth to speak the familiar Latin, but what came out was not Latin. It was not English. It was a broken fragment of the vessel's tongue, low, guttural, drawn out in a way that silenced the room instantly. She clutched her throat, horrified, trying again. But each attempt betrayed her. No scripture would come, only syllables that did not belong to her. The sisters pulled her away, dragging her to her cell. For hours she screamed prayers, beating her fists against the walls until they bled. But by midnight the screams had stopped. When they entered, they found her kneeling on the floor, her hands folded neatly, her eyes vacant. She looked at them, or rather, through them, and began to whisper. It was not frantic, not forced. Her voice was calm, measured, almost tender, and the words were clear. The same language they had heard spill from the boy for months. A perfect, flowing stream, unbroken and precise. The other sisters collapsed into tears. They begged her to stop, to fight, to remember who she was. But she only smiled, blood still wet on her knuckles, her lips moving steadily as though she were reciting something memorized long ago. By dawn, the children were gathered outside her door, listening, nodding in rhythm, their small bodies swaying like reeds in wind. They did not need Arhan's voice anymore. Sister Margaret had joined him. Another mouth, another vessel, and with her fall, the orphanage no longer felt divided. The balance had tipped. Faith was no longer the ruling power within St. Mary's. Something older had taken its throne. It began with chalk. Always chalk. The sisters thought little of it at first, children scrawling nonsense on the floor, as children often do. But these markings were not games. They were diagrams, careful and precise, always in hidden corners where the sisters seldom looked. Beneath stairwells, behind the laundry door, under the dining hall benches. Circles folding into circles, spirals breaking into jagged teeth. One morning, Sister Helena woke to find the dormitory floor covered entirely. During the night, the children had worked in silence, chalk in hand, moving like ants across the planks. Every inch of the wood was covered in glyphs and symbols that stretched from bed to bed. Even the walls bore their etchings, as though the entire room had become a manuscript. When the sisters burst in demanding answers, the children did not scatter or hide. They stood together hand in hand, facing the doorway as though waiting to be seen. One of the older girls spoke, her voice calm and eerie for her age. "We are preparing the way." That night, the ritual began. The sisters had locked the dormitory door, but somehow the children slipped into the chapel, dragging their chalk, carrying candle stubs stolen from storerooms. They drew their spirals across the stone floor where Mass had once been held, their voices rising in whispers that overlapped and thickened. The sisters rushed in to stop them, but the children did not resist. They did not even flinch. They continued, whispering faster, their chalk scratching harder, until sparks leapt from the stone as if the floor itself rejected what was being written. And then came the sound. Not from the children, not from Arhan, but from beneath the stone. A deep vibration like the bowing of a colossal string, resonating in the marrow of every body present. The lantern swung violently, their flames stretching sideways though no wind entered the chapel. The sisters screamed for them to stop, dragging the children away by force, kicking over the candles. But the marks remained glowing faintly even when scrubbed. The children were punished, beaten, isolated, starved, yet none cried, none repented. They only smiled through split lips, whispering the same phrase to each other when the sisters weren't near. "Hay is opening the gate." The vessel himself had not left his room during the ritual. He had not even moved. And yet the children swore he had led them. They said he had walked among them unseen, guiding their hands, speaking through their mouths. The sisters realized then the most terrifying truth. Arhan no longer needed to speak at all. The children could now carry the language without him. For 2 days after the ritual, the chapel was sealed. The sisters refused to enter, afraid of what they might see, or worse, hear. They prayed from their cells, fasted, whispered confessions into empty air, but none dared cross the barred doors. It was Sister Helena who finally forced them inside, insisting that cowardice was already a victory for the devil. The air hit them first. It was colder than the rest of the orphanage, as though the stone walls held winter inside their veins. The marks still remained across the floor, though no chalk was visible. They were darker now, etched into the stone itself, as though the rock had absorbed the children's writing. Helena bent low to touch one and drew her hand back as if burned. The grooves were warm, pulsing faintly, like skin over a heartbeat. At the center of the spiral, where the children had focused their whispers, the stone had cracked. A small fissure no wider than a finger, but deep, impossibly deep, vanishing into blackness. They tried to fill it, to pour wax and plaster into the gap, but the material disappeared into the void without sound, without trace. That night, the sisters kept watch in the chapel. They lit candles, recited psalms until their voices broke. But as the hours crept past midnight, a sound began to rise from the fissure. Not the vessel's noise, not the children's whispers, but something older, heavier. A low murmur, layered and vast, as if a crowd far beneath the earth were speaking all at once. The sisters fled in terror. By dawn, the chapel was locked again, its key hidden. None spoke of what they had heard, but their faces betrayed them. Pale, hollow eyes sunken as if they had glimpsed eternity and found it stealing back. The children, however, needed no keys. They began sneaking back into the chapel, pressing their small ears to the stone, smiling as though the sound was a lullaby. One boy even pressed his mouth to the fissure, whispering into it, as if answering. That was when Sister Claire confessed, trembling, that she had seen the impossible. She swore that in the candlelight, the fissure did not simply crack downward. It branched outward, as though the stone itself had veins and they were spreading. The chapel was no longer the house of God. It had become something else, a doorframe, and the children were already standing on the threshold. It happened on a storm-split night in late August. The sisters had locked the chapel as they always did, the heavy iron key hidden in Helena's cell. Yet by morning the doors stood wide open, swinging on their hinges as though some great wind had blown through. Inside, the candles were burning low, though none had been lit the night before. And one child was missing. His name was Thomas, only 8 years old. Quiet, meek, never rebellious. The kind of boy who clung to his rosary and whispered prayers long after the others had abandoned them. He was the last child anyone expected to follow the vessel. And yet his bed was empty, his shoes gone, his blanket neatly folded at the foot of the frame. The sisters tore through the orphanage. They searched the grounds, the forest, the riverbank. But when Sister Claire pushed open the chapel doors, she froze. The fissure at the center of the spiral was wider now, wide enough for a small body to slip through, and around it the marks glowed faintly, as though freshly written. Near the crack lay Thomas's rosary, broken, its beads scattered across the stone. The chain was warm to the touch. Helena reached into the fissure, trembling, and swore she felt not emptiness but breath. A slow, steady exhalation, like the lungs of something sleeping beneath. No scream had been heard that night, no struggle. It was as if Thomas had gone willingly. The sisters gathered the children and demanded to know what had happened. The little ones did not cry, did not tremble. They only answered with one voice, calm and certain. Hay wanted to go home. That was the breaking point. The sisters knew then that the orphanage was no longer theirs to govern. They had lost one child after another, but this was different. This was a surrender. The fissure was no longer a wound in the chapel. It was a mouth, and it had taken its first meal. By dawn, rumors were spilling into cold water. Farmers spoke of strange lights near the orphanage, of a low hum that carried across the fields at night. One man swore he heard children's voices rising on the wind, not laughter, not cries, but a foreign chorus that set his teeth on edge. When the story reached the bishop's desk, he could no longer dismiss it. Rome was contacted in haste. The Vatican agreed to send men, not priests for mass, not nuns for teaching, but investigators, men who knew what the church buried, men whose task was not to pray but to contain. And so, for the first time, eyes beyond cold water turned toward St. Mary's. The vessel's secret had escaped. The carriage arrived without ceremony. No trumpets, no greetings, no warmth of clergy come to console grieving sisters. Just 3 men stepping out into the mist of cold water, their boots sinking into the dirt with heavy, deliberate weight. They did not wear the flowing robes of priests, nor the soft smiles of missionaries. They were dressed in black coats, plain and severe, their collars high, their eyes sharper than any confessor's gaze. They introduced themselves only by title: Father Duval, Father Moroni, and Father Iscariot. The last name alone made the sisters shudder. The bishop welcomed them into the orphanage, but it was Helena they sought. She tried to speak of Thomas, of the rosary, of the fissure in the chapel floor. They silenced her with a raised hand. "We know what you believe you've seen," Duval said, his voice flat. "But we are not here to believe. We are here to end it." They did not waste hours in prayer. Instead, they moved directly to the chapel, carrying with them a trunk of tools. Not holy water and incense, but chisels, wax tablets, long iron rods etched with symbols Helena did not recognize. When they entered, they ordered the sisters out. Only the youngest, Sister Claire, dared linger at the threshold. She swore later that she heard the men chanting in a language not Latin, not Greek, but something that pulled at her gut like hunger. The children watched from the dormitory windows, wide-eyed, as smoke curled from the chapel doors. Some said they saw sparks of light, green and unnatural, darting through the air like fireflies. Others claimed they heard Thomas's voice echoing within, calling each of their names in turn. When the men emerged hours later, their faces were pale with sweat. Duval announced that the fissure was sealed, for now. They claimed the boy was gone, not stolen but consumed, and warned that speaking of him would only invite the same fate. Then they turned to the sisters, demanding silence. "What you think you know must end here. Do not speak of this beyond these walls. The church cannot afford another fracture." But the silence was already broken. Farmers whispered in the taverns, mothers pulled their children from the orphanage, and the town began to treat St. Mary's not as a sanctuary, but as a wound festering in its heart. The Vatican men returned to Rome within the week, leaving behind a chapel scarred, a boy missing, and a town convinced the orphanage was cursed. And beneath the floor, the breath still pulsed. Coldwater was a small town, but fear moves faster than fire. By the time harvest came, whispers had reached every hearth. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers refused to let their sons wander past the tree line. The name St. Mary's no longer meant charity. It meant danger. They said the orphanage was cursed, that the sisters harbored something unholy. Some swore the land itself was poisoned, that the well water near the grounds tasted of iron, and left mouths dry no matter how much was drunk. Others spoke of a sound that carried on the wind at night, faint, childlike voices humming in unison, too far to belong to the living, too sharp to be imagined. Merchants stopped coming. Donations slowed. The town's children began to have dreams. Parents told of waking in the night to find their sons or daughters whispering in their sleep, their mouths forming shapes no language could explain. When shaken awake, they would cry out one word only. The sisters tried to hold order inside their walls. Helena forbade any mention of Thomas. She ordered the chapel doors barred, the children kept from prayer. Yet still they found chalk markings scrawled on the walls at night, in the same curling script as the spiral on the floor. When asked, the orphans swore they hadn't drawn them, but their eyes, wide, glassy, unblinking, betrayed something else. One evening, Sister Agnes caught a group of children gathered around a candle. Their mouths moved in perfect rhythm, reciting syllables that seemed to bend the air itself. Agnes shouted for them to stop. One boy looked up at her and smiled, his teeth bloody where he had bitten his own tongue raw. He whispered, "She is teaching us." Agnes slapped the candle to the ground and dragged the children away, but the words clung to her ears like burrs. That night she couldn't sleep. When she closed her eyes, she heard it, that strange tongue, low and steady, flowing beneath her skull like a river. She pressed her palms to her ears until they bruised, but the voice only grew clearer. The town began to turn on the sisters. Farmers gathered outside the gates, demanding the orphanage be closed. The children dispersed. Helena faced them with a Bible clutched to her chest, swearing the church had sealed the danger. But her voice trembled, and the farmers saw it. For the first time, Coldwater no longer trusted its saints. It did not come as fire and pitchforks. Not yet. Coldwater's wrath arrived first in whispers, then in shadows, then in the kind of silence that tells you the world outside your window has turned against you. Merchants no longer delivered food to the gates. Farmers who once brought milk and bread turned their backs, muttering prayers under their breath. A sickness of suspicion spread through the town, a belief that even to touch what came from St. Mary's was to invite the corruption home. Inside the orphanage, the sisters felt the walls close in. Helena kept order as best she could, rationing meals, insisting on hymns. But the hymns no longer sounded like hymns. The children sang them in odd cadences, stretching syllables, bending notes until the familiar psalms became something uncanny, something older. The words seemed to fracture in their mouths, as if some invisible tongue was reshaping every verse. Sister Agnes begged Helena to send word to Rome again. "They didn't seal it?" she said in the dark of the dormitory. "They only fed it. It's still here. It's in them." But Helena would not. She had already seen how the men of the church treated their cries, not as warnings, but as embarrassments. Another summons would bring punishment, not salvation, and so the sisters began to splinter. Agnes became reckless, shaking children in the halls, demanding they speak plainly. Claire grew quieter, drifting in her prayers, drawn to the children's murmurs, as if they carried truth the sisters had lost. Helena clung to her scripture, but each night she sat awake, staring at the chapel door, listening for the faint exhalation beneath the stones. The townsfolk waited for a spark. They gathered at the tavern, whispering of children who walked in their sleep toward the orphanage gates, of mothers who found marks carved into their sons' skin, spirals, neat and shallow, drawn with nails or knives. They whispered of the missing boy, Thomas, and how his name was beginning to surface in their children's mouths, as if he had never left but was spreading like a sickness among the living. The orphanage was not simply feared, it was despised. And still, no one dared breach its walls. Not yet. For there was something more frightening than what lay inside, the sense that, if disturbed, it might spill outward. So the town waited, and inside St. Mary's the children waited too. Not restless, not afraid, patient, as if listening for a signal that had not yet come. It was not the town that moved first. It was Sister Agnes. She had been unraveling for weeks, her rosary worn thin between her fingers, her prayers muttered not in Latin but in broken pleas for sleep, for silence, for deliverance from the voice she swore lived now inside her skull. Every night it grew louder, threading through her dreams, pulling her to the chapel with a sweetness that terrified her. On the final night of August, when the children lay still in their beds and Helena's candle had long since gone out, Agnes rose. Barefoot, trembling, she carried only the iron key. She whispered to herself that she was stronger than the voice, that she would face it and banish it in Christ's name. Yet her hands shook so violently, she nearly dropped the key as she turned it in the chapel door. The hinges groaned, the air inside heavy with the stench of wax and damp stone. The spiral on the floor was waiting. It always was. But the fissure, it was wider now. No longer a crack you could mistake for an accident of stone, but an opening. A slit in the earth, dark and wet, as if the chapel floor itself were a mouth too long denied its meal. Agnes fell to her knees, clutching the cross at her throat. She began to pray. But the words would not come. They tangled in her mouth, breaking apart like glass. She tried again, louder this time, but the syllables warped, twisting into sounds she did not recognize. That was when the children appeared. Silent, barefoot, their small faces pale in the candlelight, they filled the doorway one by one. Not a sound escaped them. Not a cry, not a whisper. They only stood, watching her with eyes that did not blink. Agnes begged them to leave, but when she looked closer, she realized their mouths were moving. Not open, not speaking aloud, but shaping words beneath their lips, soundless. All of them in perfect unison. Her cross slipped from her hands. The voice inside her no longer whispered. It sang, a low, guttural hymn that shook her bones. The fissure widened, stones grinding like teeth. The air pressed down heavy, as though the chapel itself were sinking. And then a sound rose, clear and terrible, a child's laugh echoing up from the darkness below. Agnes screamed, but no one came. By morning, her body was gone. Only her rosary remained, as if crushed between teeth. At dawn, Helena found the chapel door ajar. She froze before crossing the threshold, for she already knew what she would see, or rather, what she would not. Agnes was gone. The other sisters searched every room, the woods, even the riverbank. Nothing. No footprints, no torn garments, no sign of struggle. Only her rosary on the chapel floor, the beads split as though by pressure too precise for human hands. Helena gathered the children in the hall. She asked them if they had seen Sister Agnes. Not one raised a hand. Their silence was unbroken, but their eyes told a different story. Wide, unblinking, a strange calm that chilled her deeper than screams ever could. That evening, as the sun sank over Coldwater, a sound drifted from the orphanage grounds. Not hymns, not the simple laughter of children. It was something else, a chorus, soft and eerie, as if sung by mouths that had never known language, yet carried its weight. The town heard it. Families barred their doors. Fathers stood watch with rifles across their knees, but none dared approach. In the tavern, whispers spread that the sisters themselves were being consumed, one by one, and that the children were no longer children at all. Helena tried to restore order. She ordered the chapel locked and barred, forbade the children to enter. But each morning she found the doors unlatched, the candles burned to stubs, the spiral on the floor redrawn sharper, deeper, with a precision no child's hand could manage. Claire broke down in tears before Helena one night. She confessed she had seen Agnes walking, not alive, not whole, but shadowed. Claire swore she saw her pale figure gliding through the dormitory, her lips moving in that same silent rhythm as the children. She tried to call her name, but the vision only raised a finger to her lips and vanished into the dark. Helena silenced her with a harsh hand, though terror clawed inside her chest. She could not allow such stories to spread, not among the sisters, not among the children. Order was all that remained between them and ruin. But that same night, Helena awoke to a sound she could not deny, the voices of the children chanting in their sleep. Not words she knew, not words anyone should, but words that seemed to call something closer. And she realized the town was right. It wasn't the children being consumed, it was the sisters. Helena could no longer wait for salvation from Rome, nor trust the obedience of her flock. That night, after the children had been put to bed, she lit a single candle and walked the dormitory row by row. Their faces looked peaceful, too peaceful. Every breath rose and fell in perfect unison, every chest rising as though one set of lungs commanded them all. Their lips moved faintly even in sleep, whispering a language Helena dared not lean too close to hear. At the far end of the hall, she stopped at the empty bed. Agnes's bed, the blanket still folded, the pillow untouched. For weeks Helena had told herself the woman was gone, vanished into the forest or taken by madness, but now she knew better. This was not absence. This was transformation. She gripped the iron cross at her neck, whispering the words of the Lord's Prayer, but the syllables tangled on her tongue just as Agnes's had before. She tried again, louder, teeth clenched, voice shaking. The children stirred. Not one woke, but the room shifted. The air thickened, as though 100 unseen hands pressed against her skin. Then one child opened his eyes. It was Samuel, the smallest, no more than 6. He sat up slowly, his head tilting to one side, his pupils wide and bottomless. His lips curved into a faint smile. "Mother Helena," he said, though his voice did not sound like a child's. It was layered, hollow, as though something spoke through him from a cavern far below the earth. "Do not be afraid." She only went first. The others stirred, eyes opening one after another, each fixing on her with the same calm emptiness. Helena stumbled backward, clutching the cross to her chest, her candle flickering wildly. "We are not lost," Samuel continued. "We are learning the tongue that was taken, the one that called the world into being. She teaches us. And soon you will join." The children rose as one, moving with a slow, dreadful grace. Their bare feet made no sound on the floorboards. Helena turned and fled, her candle dying in the draft of her own panic. She slammed the dormitory doors shut and braced her back against them, sobbing. From within came the chorus, rising, weaving unbroken, not screams, not cries. The sound of children singing in a language older than time. Helena realized then. The town could never be allowed inside. Not because they wouldn't understand, but because they would, and the world would never be the same. By the second week of September, Coldwater had run out of patience. For too long the orphanage had been a shadow at the edge of their lives, a place once meant for God's mercy that now seemed to house something else entirely. The whispers in taverns had grown into shouts at the chapel doors. Men who had sworn never to raise a hand against the church now spoke of oil, of torches, of fire, as the only baptism left. At the town hall, a meeting was called. Every chair filled, every wall lined with bodies pressing close. Mothers wept as they spoke of their children waking with spiral scratches on their arms. Fathers growled of hearing voices at night calling their names in tones that were not their sons nor daughters. One old farmer, eyes gone rheumy with age, stood and declared that he remembered hearing the same sounds in his youth, when his father spoke of St. Mary's land being cursed long before the orphanage was built. His father had warned, "The earth there has a mouth. Build over it and it will eat." The hall erupted, they voted. By dawn, a mob would march on St. Mary's. Some carried pitchforks, others rifles. But most carried only fury, sharpened into a single thought. If the sisters would not abandon the place, then the town would burn it to ash. Inside the orphanage, Helena felt the tide turning. The air itself seemed heavier each day, the walls groaning like a ship taking on water. She tried to keep the children safe, tried to keep the hymns alive, but their voices overpowered her, bending every melody into that cursed tongue. She knew the town was coming. She could hear the shouts carried on the wind, could see the torches gathering at the edge of the fields. Claire begged her to flee, to take the children and escape before the mob arrived. But Helena shook her head. "If we open those gates, we carry this plague into the world," she whispered. "Better we die here than let it spread." That night, as the mob lit their torches and began the slow march towards St. Mary's, the sisters gathered in the chapel. The spiral had widened into something vast, an abyssal wound swallowing the floor. The candles bent inward, their flames pulled as though by breath, and from below rose a sound louder than any mob's cry, the laughter of children echoing up from the dark, joined by the solemn, broken hymn of Sister Agnes. The gates rattled under the fists of Coldwater. The walls trembled under something deeper. St. Mary's was no longer waiting. It was calling. The mob reached the gates just past midnight, their torches blood orange against the fog, their shouts carried like war drums through the hollow fields. Fathers, sons, mothers clutching lanterns, none with mercy in their eyes. They had come not to rescue, not to reason, but to erase. The iron gates groaned under their weight, the lock splitting with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. The crowd surged forward, storming the grounds of St. Mary's, their boots pounding the earth in rhythm with their rage. But as they neared the doors, their voices faltered. The sound inside the orphanage was unlike anything they had prepared for. Not screams, not hymns. A chorus. Children's voices woven into a single, seamless song, high and low, layered and vast, as though dozens of throats had become one instrument. The language was alien, curling and sharp, yet carried a rhythm that set their teeth on edge and their hearts pounding in their chests. A woman screamed, dropping her torch. The fire sputtered in the grass. "That's no prayer," she cried. "That's no God." But still the mob pressed on. They slammed their shoulders against the wooden doors until the hinges splintered. The orphanage groaned like a beast disturbed from its sleep. Inside, they found the sisters on their knees in the chapel, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on the spiral that now dominated the floor. What had once been a fissure was no longer a crack. It was an opening, wide, and wet, its edges pulsing as though alive. The children stood at its edge, hand in hand, their mouths moving in perfect unison. None turned to face the mob. None flinched at the crash of the doors. They simply sang, their voices rising as one, the air trembling with their impossible tongue. One man fired his rifle into the air, demanding silence. But the bullet never struck stone. It vanished the moment it crossed the spiral's edge, swallowed into nothing. A scream rose from the mob as torches flickered and died, their flames smothered as though the chapel itself had exhaled. Helena turned to the crowd then, her face streaked with tears, her voice broken. "You cannot stop it. It is already in them. It is already in us." And as the mob hesitated, frozen between rage and terror, the spiral pulsed. A sound rose from the opening. Not the voices of children this time, but something deeper, ancient, hungry. The orphanage had become a mouth, and the town had stepped inside it. Panic spread through the mob like fire through dry straw. Men who had come with righteous fury now staggered backward, crossing themselves with trembling hands. Women clutched at their sons, dragging them away from the chapel doors. But the children moved. Not wildly, not like beasts. Slowly, deliberately, as though following a rhythm none of the intruders could hear. They turned in unison, their eyes reflecting the torchlight in unnatural glints, their lips still shaping the forbidden tongue. Then they spoke aloud. The sound hit the mob like a wave. Not words as men know them, but vibrations that rattled bone and split thought. Some screamed and dropped to their knees, clutching their ears as blood seeped between their fingers. Others staggered back in silence, their jaws slack, their eyes rolling white as the language bored into them like drills. One man tried to strike, a farmer with an axe. He swung at the nearest child, a boy no older than 7, but the axe never landed. The boy simply opened his mouth, and the man's body seized. His weapon clattered to the floor, his limbs locking as though invisible hands had bound him. Then, with a shudder, he turned the blade upon himself. The mob broke. Some ran for the doors, only to find them sealed as though the wood had fused into stone. Others fled deeper into the orphanage, desperate for windows, for exits, for any escape. But every corridor led them back to the chapel. No matter which way they turned, they returned to the spiral, to the children, to the abyssal mouth that waited beneath the stones. Helena rose slowly from her knees. She was shaking, tears carving lines down her face. Yet her voice was steady when she spoke. "You see it now. This is not our choice. It is the world's correction. They were chosen not by us, not by Rome, but by what came before." The children's voices swelled, their chant filling every crevice of the orphanage. The walls groaned, beams cracking, plaster raining down like dust from an ancient tomb. And as the spiral widened, the mob realized the truth too late. They had not come to destroy the orphanage. They had come to feed it. The chapel became a cage. The spiral widened with every syllable the children spoke, its edges splitting stone, its darkness rising like a tide. The mob stumbled back, pressing against the walls, but the walls no longer obeyed their structure. They bent inward, arching like ribs, as though the orphanage itself had become flesh. One by one, the intruders were taken. Not dragged, not seized, but pulled as though the very air betrayed them. A man clawed at the pews, his fingernails ripping free as his body slid across the floor, his screams cut short the moment he crossed the spiral's edge. Another woman clung to her son, but the boy slipped from her arms with a serenity that broke her. She lunged after him, and both vanished into the black mouth below. Some tried to fract. Rifles cracked, blades swung, torches thrust toward the children. But every weapon dissolved the instant it neared the spiral, swallowed as though reality itself would not allow steel or flame to enter. The mob's fury became terror, their terror became pleading. But the children did not stop. Their chant grew louder, echoing as though 1,000 voices now joined them from beneath the earth. Helena stood in the center, torn between horror and a grim aching acceptance. Her life had been spent in obedience to Rome, in service to Scripture, in silence before questions she was forbidden to ask. And now, here, before the abyss, she saw what the Church had always feared, not sin, not heresy, but truth. Agnes had not been lost. She had been chosen. The children were not victims. They were vessels. And she, Helena, who had fought to keep them bound to hymns and prayers, had been nothing more than a wall trying to hold back the tide. Claire clutched at her habit, screaming for her to flee, to fight, to save at least the youngest. But Helena did not move. Her eyes were fixed on the spiral. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with the trembling of release. She whispered a prayer, not in Latin, not in English, but in the fractured syllables that had haunted her dreams for months. She whispered a prayer, not in Latin, not in English, but in the fractured syllables that had haunted her dreams for months. The children paused. Their eyes turned to her. And for the first time, their voices faltered, as though acknowledging her place among them. Helena stepped forward. Claire screamed as she crossed the edge. The abyss did not swallow her. It welcomed her. And the mob realized, too late, that the sisters were no longer guardians of the children. They were disciples of what lay beneath. By dawn, Coldwater was silent. The orphanage had not burned. It had not collapsed. From the outside, it stood exactly as it always had. A simple stone building with crooked windows, its roofline jagged against the pale morning sky. To any traveler on the road, it might have seemed untouched by violence, untouched by time. But the villagers who had gathered outside in the night knew better. They had heard the screams. They had seen neighbors vanish into the doors. Some had tried to rush inside, but the threshold would not yield. The door was sealed, fused as though no hinge or lock had ever existed. Others had circled the building, searching for cracks, for smoke, for signs of life. There was nothing, only silence. At sunrise, one dared to press his ear against the cold stone. His breath caught. Behind the walls, he swore he could hear children singing, not in English, not in Latin, but in that same broken, impossible tongue. The melody was steady, unhurried, as if the night's chaos had only been rehearsal for something larger, something now unfolding in perfect harmony. Word spread quickly. Some called for fire, demanding the orphanage be burned to its foundation. But when torches were thrown against the stone, the flames recoiled, refusing to cling. Oil poured along the walls would not ignite. Even the strongest men could not pry loose a single stone. It was as though the building had withdrawn from the world of men. By midday, fear grew into superstition. Mothers pulled their children close, whispering that to even look at the windows was to risk being seen. And though no figure ever appeared in the glass, the villagers felt eyes upon them. Countless eyes, as if the very shadows of the orphanage leaned forward to watch. Some fled Coldwater that very day, abandoning homes their families had kept for generations. Others remained, convinced the church would arrive to deal with the matter. But Rome never came. Letters were sent, riders dispatched. No answer returned. The name of Coldwater began to slip quietly from maps, as though the town itself was being erased one page at a time, and yet the building remained. A shell in daylight, a beacon at night, for those who lingered. The air was heavy with an unspoken certainty. The children were not gone, they were waiting. Weeks passed and Coldwater rotted in silence. Shops closed first. The blacksmith left his forge cold. The baker's oven stood empty. The schoolhouse locked its doors. At night, the streets were vacant, yet the sound of children's laughter drifted through alleys where no child remained. Windows were shuttered, but neighbors swore that when they woke in the dark, they saw silhouettes on the other side of the glass. Small figures, standing motionless, watching. The fear did not break suddenly. It spread, thin and steady, like rot beneath a floorboard. One family would vanish, their home left as though abandoned mid-breath, food on the table, clothes drying by the fire. Days later, another would be found wandering the forest in silence, their eyes vacant, their mouths moving in shapes that produced no sound. By the third week, half the town had gone, and those who stayed did so because they felt trapped by something more than fear, as though leaving would not free them, but only hasten their claim. The orphanage became the center of it all. By day, it appeared the same, a husk of stone, unyielding, unchanged. But at night, the walls pulsed faintly, as though veins ran beneath the masonry. Lantern light revealed a shimmer along the roofline, like breath condensing against unseen glass. And always, from within, the low drone of voices. The chant of children, unbroken, tireless, endless. Whispers began. Helena had not perished. She had chosen them. Some said they saw her on the steps at night, her habit torn, her eyes black as coal, cradling a child with skin too pale to belong to this earth. Others swore the children roamed the fields at dusk, scattering into the woods, leaving trails of symbols carved into the bark. Men followed those marks once, torches in hand, but they never returned. Only their torches did, set neatly outside their own doors the next morning, still burning though their fuel was gone. The church, still silent, sent no word. And for those who remained, a deeper dread took root. Perhaps Rome knew. Perhaps Rome had always known. The name Coldwater began to fade from conversation, avoided not from ignorance but from fear. To speak of it aloud was to invite notice, to draw those pale, watching eyes to your own threshold. And so the town withered, not from famine, not from fire, but from erasure. The kind of erasure that begins when something larger than history decides you are no longer meant to exist. Inside the orphanage, time did not move the same. To the villagers outside, weeks passed in silence and dread. But for Helena, there was no measure of days, no sunrise, no dusk, only the hum, that ceaseless, living vibration that seemed to pulse in the marrow of her bones. She did not sleep. She did not hunger. She stood among the children as though caught in a current that carried her deeper than flesh, deeper than thought. The children had changed. Their bodies remained small, fragile, human, but their presence was not. Their eyes no longer followed light. Their mouths did not move when the chant rose. It came from somewhere deeper, as though the very walls borrowed their voices. The spiral on the chapel floor had grown. What had once been a carving in stone now pulsed with depth, as though the earth had parted to reveal a wound that could never heal. At times Helena swore she saw faces within it. Vast, indistinct, pressing against some unseen barrier. They did not smile. They did not scowl. They simply watched, patient and unblinking, the way the sea watches a drowning man. Each time she looked too long, she felt herself leaning forward, drawn as if her body longed to fall. Only the hand of Agnes, pale, warm, impossibly real, on her sleeve would steady her. Agnes was always there. Not aged, not lost. 8 years old exactly as she had been the night she vanished. Do not fear it, Agnes whispered once, though her lips never moved. It was here before men built churches. It will remain after their ruins crumble. Helena tried to pray, but the words of Rome crumbled in her mouth. The Latin, once carved into her soul, seemed hollow, counterfeit. The only language that held shape in her throat was theirs. The broken syllables, the forbidden cadence. When she finally allowed the sounds to form, the children turned toward her, not with the innocence of wards, but with the solemnity of kin. Claire was no longer with her. Helena remembered her scream, remembered the pull of her habit as Claire tried to drag her back from the spiral. But there was no memory of her leaving. Perhaps she had been taken. Perhaps she had fled. Perhaps she had been erased like the others. Helena no longer asked. There was only the chant, the spiral, the waiting, and the certainty, heavy as stone, that the children were no longer children. They were the beginning of something the world had not seen in centuries. It came to Helena one night. Not in a vision, not in a dream, but in the raw silence between chants. For the first time in weeks, the children stopped. The hum dissolved. The orphanage fell still. She waited, breath shallow, as though the absence of sound was heavier than the sound itself. Then, without warning, the words began to shape themselves in her mind. Not spoken, not heard, revealed. The language was not meant for men. That much was clear. It was not built for the tongue, nor for air, nor for ink. It belonged to something deeper, older, something that lived beneath thought itself. She realized with a slow, dawning horror that each syllable was not a word, but a binding, a command. Not communication, but control. The children had not been reciting, they had been reshaping. Her stomach twisted when she recalled the villagers who had vanished, Their disappearance had not been violence. It had been obedience. The moment they heard the cadence, their bodies simply followed as though the words had tugged at the strings of their souls. That was the truth Rome had hidden. Not demons. Not demons. Not possession. Control. The kind of control that could bind not one man, not one town, but entire nations. If only the language were spoken loud enough, long enough. She staggered back from the spiral, clutching her chest, her breath breaking into sobs. The walls pulsed around her like veins. The faces beneath the floor pressed closer, their mouths shifting silently, lips forming the very syllables that now burned in her mind. Agnes appeared at her side. Her small hand touched Helena's wrist, steady, calm. They feared us because we remembered. The girl whispered without sound. Not because we sinned. Not because we strayed. But because we were taught to speak what no empire should ever hold. Helena's tears fell freely now. All those years, she had bowed before altars, recited verses, confessed sin she barely understood. And all along, the church had been guarding not the faithful, but itself. Guarding against the possibility that this language could surface again. Guarding against the truth that obedience could be broken and rewritten. She looked into Agnes's pale eyes and finally understood. The children were not cursed, they were inheritors. And Helena, had already begun to speak their inheritance aloud. The first test came without intention. Helena had not meant to speak. The syllables rose from her throat unbidden, like breath after drowning, like blood from a wound. She was standing at the chapel window, staring through the warped glass at the distant fields, where cold water ended and the world began. A handful of villagers had gathered in the distance, their shapes small, torches flickering against the horizon. They were waiting. For her, for the children, for judgment. The chant spilled from her lips, 3 syllables only. Not the full cadence, not even words she understood. Just fragments, raw and jagged. At once the torches faltered. She saw the men stagger, clutching their chests. One fell to his knees, head snapping back as though invisible hands yanked him toward the sky. Another raised his torch against his own face, the fire licking his skin, and yet he did not scream. They did not resist. They obeyed. Helena gasped, covering her mouth, but the sound continued, flowing past her will. Behind her, the children echoed it, their eyes shining in the candlelight, their bodies swaying in rhythm. The walls vibrated. The floor throbbed like a living heart. The spiral widened, a dark pulse in the stone. Outside, the villagers dropped one by one, not dead but kneeling. They pressed their foreheads to the soil, their torches snuffed, their bodies bent in perfect synchrony. To any distant witness, it would not have looked like terror. It would have looked like worship. Helena staggered back, horrified. She wanted to scream, to demand it stop. But deep inside her, buried beneath the panic, was something worse than fear. It was exhilaration. For the first time in her life, she had spoken and the world had bent to her voice. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally. Agnes smiled faintly, her pale hair catching the glow of the candles. Do you see? She whispered without sound. This is why they silence us. Not because it is evil, but because it is stronger than them. And once spoken, it cannot be forgotten. Helena collapsed to her knees, trembling, her palms pressed to the cold stone. The chant had stopped now, but its echo remained in her chest, like a second heartbeat. She looked at the children, their small frames bathed in shadows, and realized there was no going back. Coldwater was no longer a forgotten town. It was the mouth of something vast, and its voice had just touched the world beyond. The change did not stay in Coldwater. Within days, the neighboring towns began to whisper of odd behaviors, of men abandoning their families in the night, of women waking to find their husbands standing in the fields, faces lifted toward the sky as though awaiting some unseen command. Churches emptied, not from rebellion but from absence. Congregations simply stopped arriving, pews left hollow, sermons spoken to silence. No one understood why. There was no plague, no famine, no fire. But wherever the chant had carried on the wind, order broke down. Priests reciting Mass found their Latin faltering, their tongues betraying them with sounds they did not mean to speak. Children scribbled strangels into their schoolbooks, then stared blankly when questioned. Farmers tilled spirals into their fields without realizing it, walking in circles until their oxen collapsed from exhaustion. It spread like a shadow that no one could name. And yet, inside the orphanage, Helena knew exactly why. She could feel it in her chest, that echo of the syllables she had spoken, growing louder each day. It was not only within her, it was through her, as though she had become a channel. And the children did not need to move their lips anymore. The chant was constant in them, radiating outward, reshaping everything it touched. Helena tried to resist. She prayed in the old ways, forced the Latin through her clenched teeth, but the words collapsed into gibberish. She begged the crucifix on the wall for strength, but the wood had begun to warp, its edges curling inward, the figure on it barely human anymore. She tore it down, hurled it into the spiral, and the spiral swallowed it without sound. Her horror deepened, but so too did something else. In the silence after the crucifix vanished, she felt power roll through her like heat. It was intoxicating. She had spent her entire life kneeling before authority. Rome, scripture, tradition, obedience. And now, with a breath, with a syllable, she could bend men to their knees. She should have been afraid. Instead, she was trembling with hunger. The faces beneath the spiral pressed closer, mouths opening in perfect unison. Agnes leaned at her side, eyes glimmering. "You are not meant to be their servant," the child whispered. "You are meant to be their voice." And in that moment, Helena knew she could never return to the silence of obedience. The language had chosen her. Helena stood before the spiral, trembling, as if on the edge of a precipice. For weeks she had resisted, clinging to scraps of faith, but faith had grown brittle, crumbling at the touch. What remained was the hum, the chant, the pulse of words that did not belong to men. The children watched her in silence, dozens of pale faces glowing in the candlelight. They were not waiting for comfort. They were not waiting for guidance. They were waiting for her to choose. She drew breath, and the first syllable came sharp, jagged, alive. The stone beneath her feet vibrated, dust falling in a fine mist from the rafters. The children swayed in unison, their eyes rolling white, their mouths opening though no sound passed their lips. Another syllable followed, and the spiral surged, widening as if the earth itself inhaled. She did not falter this time. Her voice deepened with each sound, no longer fragile, no longer borrowed. The forbidden cadence poured through her like fire through dry grass. The walls bent inward, candles guttered, and the chapel groaned as if its bones might snap. Outside, though she could not see it, the effect rippled across the land. In the nearest town, bells rang without hands to strike them, their iron throats spilling tones that twisted into the chant. Farmers dropped their tools and knelt in the soil, bowing their heads in the same spiral shape they had carved unknowingly into their fields. Priests fell silent at their altars, unable to form Latin prayers, their voices stolen mid-breath. Children in their beds began murmuring in sleep, syllables older than time itself tumbling from their small mouths. Helena's arms rose, her palms open. She had become the vessel. The spiral was not below anymore. It was within her, spilling outward, uncontained. For the first time she understood the truth in full. This language was not made to ask. It was not made to plead. It was made to command, and command it did. The children rose together, their movements synchronized, not puppet-like, but sovereign, regal, inevitable. Agnes stood at their front, her face serene, her gaze steady. She did not look at Helena as a child looks to a guardian. She looked at her as one ruler greets another. Helena did not feel fear anymore. She did not feel doubt. She felt destiny. The spiral had given her a voice, and the world was already listening. The night Helena first spoke with intent, the world shifted. She was no longer repeating fragments. She was no longer trembling in resistance. She chose the words now, shaping them with purpose, and the air bent around her like metal drawn to a magnet. The spiral throbbed at her feet, no longer a wound but a mouth, waiting, hungering. This time she did not direct her voice toward the empty fields or the helpless villagers. She aimed higher, farther, toward the seat of the power that had ruled her life, Rome. The words poured from her throat like molten iron, harsh, relentless. The chapel shook with the force of them. The children dropped to their knees, not in submission, but in resonance, their bodies vibrating in time with the cadence. Agnes stood tall, her face lifted, as if listening to a distant echo Helena could not yet hear, and in that moment, the chant carried across oceans. Thousands of miles away, in cathedrals and chapels, priests froze mid-sermon. Congregations stirred uneasily, crossing themselves, their Latin faltering on their tongues. Bishops in gilded halls clutched at their chests, as if strings had been pulled taut inside them. Candles guttered in basilicas. Bells tolled without hands to ring them. In the Vatican archives, where the oldest secrets were kept beneath stone and iron, a single tomb fell from its shelf. Its pages opened to symbols carved centuries before, symbols that matched the spiral now widening in cold water. Monks and archivists dropped to their knees, not in prayer, but in silent, helpless obedience. The Church had always feared this. Helena could feel it in the marrow of her bones. This was not heresy. This was not blasphemy. This was superiority. The forbidden tongue did not kneel to Scripture. It rewrote Scripture. It did not answer to altars. It hollowed them. And Helena, helpless, trembling, exalted, was no longer just a sister. She was a voice carried on a current older than empires. Her chant rose and she felt their resistance falter. Cardinals who had sworn their lives to silence and control now bent forward, sweat dripping, their mouths betraying them with syllables they had never learned. The center of Christendom was cracking, not from blade or fire, but from a woman's voice in a forgotten orphanage on the edge of America. When Helena finally fell silent, the children stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes. Agnes stepped forward, her small hand resting against Helena's trembling arm. "It has begun," she whispered, though her lips never moved. And Helena, for the first time, did not doubt. There was no going back. By the final night, the orphanage no longer felt like stone and timber. Its walls pulsed as if alive, its windows blackened as though refusing the intrusion of daylight. The spiral stretched across the entire chapel floor now, a vast, breathing wound, its edges spilling light so dark it looked like liquid shadow. Helena stood at the center. The children gathered around her in perfect stillness. She had not eaten in weeks. She had not slept. Yet her body did not weaken. Every time the chant rose, she grew stronger, her skin humming with power, her voice heavier, sharper. The children followed, their eyes glassy, their forms no longer fragile but terrible in their serenity. Agnes stood at the front, no longer a child but a figure outside of age, her face pale and radiant, her gaze steady and endless. And then it began. The chant spread outward, not through walls, not through air, but through the marrow of the world. Cities stirred, churches cracked. Men woke from their beds screaming words they did not understand, their wives weeping as the syllables tore from their throats. In villages across Europe, in towns across America, the same sound rose, countless voices speaking as one, though none knew why. Rome itself quaked. Bells rang without touch. Cathedrals trembled as though struck by unseen storms. In the Vatican, the oldest priests wept openly, whispering what they had sworn never to reveal. The forbidden tongue was awake again. It had been buried once, centuries before, but the Church had never destroyed it, only delayed it. And now it had returned, not as a rumor, not as a curse, but as a flood. Helena lifted her arms, her voice swelling until it was not hers at all, until it was the voice of the spiral itself. The children followed, their mouths still, yet their words filling the air. Together they became something no power, no empire, no institution could silence. And then, silence. The orphanage was empty. When villagers dared to return weeks later, they found only stone walls and shattered pews. The spiral was gone, the floor whole, as if untouched. No bodies. No trace of Helena. Only the faint smell of wax and earth, and the sense that something had passed through and left the world altered. Cold water emptied soon after. Families abandoned their homes. The name disappeared from records. And those who survived carried only a story, one they whispered to their children, one those children whispered again, that once, in the year 1964, there was a language spoken in America, a language that was not meant for men. A language that, once heard, could never be forgotten. And if you listen closely enough, they say you can still hear it. In the hum beneath your own breath, in the silence between words, in the dreams that leave you trembling at dawn. Not a curse, not a lie, but a command waiting to be spoken again.